Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast. That is, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here on Potomac Watch with Kate Batchelder Odell and Kim Strasser. We're talking about the Supreme Court and it's being thrust into a central role in the 2024 election. One issue coming up is that Clarence Thomas ought to recuse himself from these cases, Justice Thomas, because his wife, Ginny, sent some overwrought emails to former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows in the wake of the 2020 election about the stolen election. She clearly bought the Trump claims that the election was stolen and urged Meadows to do something about it, not that there was any action she took that had any consequence. She also signed some letters to state legislators in the case asking them to investigate voter fraud. So she had a point of view on the election, no question, but she's not a participant in any direct way in any of the litigation or prosecutions now in these cases. So the question is whether any of that should be disqualifying for a justice. Kate, this is being pounded now by the left, and I think it's going to be even louder if the Supreme Court takes up these cases.
Right. I mean, what you just noted is that we're missing really any connection of how Clarence Thomas's wife's own views about the elections influenced his jurisprudence to any extent. There's no real even allegation of that. And for those of us who follow Clarence Thomas and his jurisprudence, you know, he's an immovable force as a thinker anyway. So there's not even an allegation that there was any influence on how he ruled or how he thought about these cases. It's just pure innuendo that the left is making. You do have now Democrats in Congress are firing off letters to the chief, basically saying you've got to make sure that Clarence Thomas recuses himself. And exerting that political pressure, I think, is actually extremely counterproductive for their own goals, because if he were to recuse now, he would look like he just capitulated to Democrats. So I don't think that's a compelling argument. I think on the substantive side, one thing that is worth noting that we've written about is that the justices have a duty to sit, which means they have an obligation to participate in these cases unless there's a significant reason that they cannot. And one practical implication of that would be, for instance, we're talking about how much better it would be for the country if these rulings were unanimous. Well, if someone recuses themselves and you end up with a 4-4 decision, that is hardly going to be a good outcome no matter what. So there are far other equities here that I don't think get as much attention of why justices don't recuse themselves and why they shouldn't just be taken hostages by the view of any particular Democratic senator or House member to do so.
All right, let's turn to a second issue, which is the U.S. Senate left town for Christmas and through the end of the year without a deal that some members were negotiating on the border and on Ukraine. Let's consider where that stands, and let's listen to Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Minority Leader Mitch McConnell as he described the state of play.
I am much more hopeful today than I was last Thursday. Leader McConnell's people are at the table. The administration's top people are at the table, as are mine and the three negotiators, and we've made a lot of progress. This is just a difficult issue, both in coming up with an agreement and then drafting it, because we haven't drafted things like this before. But I'm optimistic that we can get things done when we get back. Our goal is, as soon as we get back, to get something done.
The most complicated part of it, actually, is the border. I think we haven't passed a significant immigration bill since Reagan's second term. And so this is not easy.
Not easy, Kim Strassel. Obviously, this is really about border security and doing some things like changing the definition of what it takes to file for asylum and then stay in the country after you have a credible fear. They want to raise the standard from credible fear. It's also an issue about parole, so-called humanitarian parole, which the administration has used to let in migrants into the country. The Republicans want to limit that. Also, a couple of other issues here. So the question is, can it get done next year when they come back? There is not a formal deadline on any of this, but there is some urgency because of Ukraine's position militarily. It needs more aid. The Biden administration has said that they have enough money for one more aid package to Ukraine, and they really do need a weapons infusion by at least early February.
The most hopeful thing you heard there was Chuck Schumer being where he is today, because that is a total about face. And it's why we have taken so long to get a deal on this. Republicans have been very clear now for several months that their price, as it were, or their demand in return for Ukraine funding was going to be some sort of substantive change at the border. And the White House and Senate Democrats, especially the progressives, were simply in denial about this for a very long time. They were trying every trick in the book to try to just say, well, we'll throw more money at the border. And Republicans, to their credit, really stuck together. In fact, they had a vote not long ago. Chuck Schumer tried to get through a standalone Ukraine bill. Every Republican in the Senate voted no to send the message again. And that's when the White House began to get serious. I think it understands that its own legacy and the future of the Ukrainian warfight and its ability to help is going to depend on it playing ball on what is clearly a very significant problem at the border. And so they do seem to be making some progress on those issues you mentioned. There is a lot of heel dragging by progressives, and there's been a lot of progressive members of the Hispanic caucus warning that no deal is acceptable. But I think what you're seeing is a large portion in the middle, on the right and the left, that have understood the broad contours of this deal. There is a lot of detail to get worked out, but I think it's still possible. It's going to be a little tougher doing it when you get back in the new year because we're moving into peak presidential primary period, and that's going to add a lot of political pressure. But I think that everyone at least is on the same page now.
I spoke to a Republican senator this week who's in the teeth of these negotiations, who was fairly optimistic about getting something in the new year, said that the Republicans decided that they hadn't had enough from the administration. The administration just really, as you said, recently convened to get into the negotiations, take it seriously. But they're engaged now, think they can get something done in the new year, understanding that Donald Trump will probably oppose it and any deal because he doesn't want any progress on the border. But if you want to make some incremental progress there to improve security, that's what the Republican senators are trying for. And senators said, well, you can probably get 25 or so Republican senators in favor of it. Then the president would have to deliver 35 Democrats to be able to beat a filibuster. So it's doable if, Kate, the president, makes the adequate concessions on the border.
You would think that the political scenario you just laid out would incline Biden to do a deal that would allow him to get some credit for making some progress on the border. We haven't quite seen that yet. Still, really, the deal is hung up on this question of parole and how many people can be paroled into the country under that program, and then provisions that involve a third country of people arriving via a third country. So there are still sticking points. I am optimistic there will be a deal in January, though. Government funding starts to hit Congress again in January, and there's already debates about that, and that's going to absorb a lot of oxygen in addition to the primaries that Kim mentioned. And you do also have the reality that I don't think Ukraine's going to collapse between now and February either. I think that they can use their stocks sufficiently and survive for Congress to make a deal in January. But you do also have the reality that Russia is launching some fresh offensives. They're very costly. They are not making great gains, but they are still slogging away at it in Ukraine. And you also have potentially them Russians stepping out missile barrages on Ukrainian cities like they did last winter. All that to say, the war in Ukraine is a precarious situation that really does demand some degree of urgency. So I think the risk is in, building a progressive holdouts over the break, and it could drag on. And these weapons that we've sent Ukraine have taken some time to get there. So I do think there's reason to be cautiously optimistic that a deal gets done, but hopefully the urgency of the situation continues to be clear to the lawmakers doing the deal.
All of which suggests that early January will not be uneventful, as it sometimes is. It's going to be high drama in Congress, or whether they can get some things done, both on the budget and on the supplemental aid for Ukraine. We will be covering all of it in the new year, but also in the holiday period. Some of us will be working, and so please check in. We sure appreciate that you are listeners, and glad to have you here. Thanks for listening.